what we're seeing here is a real expansion of the concept of what it is that is causing our ADHD struggles.
Dopamine is being turned into stress and you're just trying to send an email.
When it should just be turning into motivation.
Can't you just pay attention? Like, no, actually.
No, dopamine receptors won't go there.
The dopamine has left the building.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a very, very special episode of Research Recap. We are going to be diving into the world of dopamine, aka the thing that is probably underpinning a lot of the struggles that you've been having. Just a disclaimer up front, Sarah and I are not neuroscientists, but we both love neuroscience. So we're going to be diving into dopamine receptors, different kinds of, genetic systems and other systems.
Transporter systems,
neurotransmitters, it's all here. But we're going to make it accessible. We're going to make sure that you are taken along for the ride. And hopefully by the time you finish this episode today, you're going to feel a lot more confident in understanding and explaining how your brain works. You ready to get started, Sarah?
I'm so ready to get started. We have so much to get through.
Yes, exactly. So we're going to start with a paper that comes all the way back to the origins of unconventional organization. I'm a former academic and I studied neuroscience into honors and then left. But, one of the things we learn when we study neuroscience is that if it's just a year or two old, everything is, not relevant anymore. It's such a fast-paced area where there's new things being discovered every day. But back when I first started, I focused very much on a paper from Tripp and Wickens in 2009. It was made. It's from the Journal of Neuropharmacology, and it presents a theory to account for the way that we process dopamine with ADHD. And it really went through this theory. And this theory became a big part of what we taught at Unconventional Organization. We always talk about the fact that everything we do is research backed. And so it's really exciting to kind of go back into and then expand on something that we used. So this is kind of us doing that in real time. Do you want to take us through a little bit about what this paper is in terms of its methodology, Sarah?
Yeah, so essentially this paper is just so many references. It's a literature review. It pretty much just wanted to combine all of the information that we had currently about things like etiology of ADHD, certain neurobehavioral concepts like motivation, really just trying to see like at that current time, like what we knew about the brain and like the images that we were able to take at that time and the models that they were able to create about like what affected what.
Yeah, definitely. They were still learning so much. Can you give us a definition of etiology?
In this context, etiology is talking about like everything they knew about what might cause ADHD. So they were looking at things like genetic studies, brain imaging studies. At that time, I think they were using things like fMRIs, which we still use today, but we have lots of other cool things too.
Yeah. So basically, they went through everything. And I highly recommend if you are interested in kind of getting into an understanding of how dopamine works in the brain, this is a great paper. We're going to link it below. It's got some really great pictures. It kind of explains it. But what they did once they'd gone through an understanding of the neural mechanisms, the neurobehavioral concepts, etc., is they proposed a theory based on all of this. And what they basically proposed was what they called the dopamine transfer deficit theory. And this theory actually became a really important part of what we teach today at Unconventional Organization, because what they proposed based on all of the research that they discussed was that ADHD, some of the symptoms of ADHD may be explained by a failure of the dopamine cell response to transfer to earlier predictors of the reward. And what that essentially meant was that in people who didn't have ADHD, in this case, they're really focusing on children, the dopamine cell response basically transfers to earlier cues that predict reinforcement, which, if we're being really simple, we can just use any example. So can you think of an example of you doing a boring task, Sarah?
Filling out paperwork.
Right, filling out paperwork. Perfect. So what they found is that in people who didn't have ADHD, in this case, in children who didn't have ADHD, what they proposed was that there is immediate reinforcement at the cellular level when they take on a task, even when behavioral reinforcement, aka the reward, is delayed. So you're getting some kind of dopaminergic boost when you do something, say filling out paperwork. But if you have ADHD, what they found was that the transfer of the dopamine cell response to the cue that predicts reinforcement, aka feel good, you're doing a thing, go you, that fails to occur. That was their theory. And that leads to a delayed reinforcement if the behavioral reinforcement is delayed, which essentially means that if your reward, and I remember circling this and like looking at it at the time, it was so interesting. It essentially means that if you have ADHD, you're not receiving that cellular level dopaminergic reward in the same way as somebody who's neurotypical. You're just doing paperwork and it sucks. That's it. If you want to really explain it. And if you don't give yourself a reward and that reward isn't really connected, it can be really hard to get a sense of it. They said at present we cannot account for how such a deficit arises. They did have some ideas. They said it's not obvious that it would arise from altered DAT1 or DRD4 functions, which are like different receptors that we're going to talk about more in a moment. They said maybe altered prefrontal cortex function could contribute, but there's other possibilities as well. Existing evidence does not permit a strong conclusion about the cause. And so that was kind of where they left it. But that was their theory. And it was one of the things that prompted what we talk about today when we talk about ADHD, and is a bit different from, I think, other spaces where we say, hey, give yourself a reward for starting the task because your brain's not necessarily going to give it to you. And that, simple strategy, it comes from that paper and its proposal. And it's worked so well for hundreds of people with ADHD since then. So I'm a pretty big fan. But that was in 2009. So I am so excited today to think about what's gone on since then.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear it in these words. When I sort of looked up the dopamine transfer deficit, it gave me words like anticipatory trigger not present. Sort of like when you smell food, food is coming and you start to salivate, and then just imagine that you smell the food, but you don't start to salivate or get hungry.
Or no food is coming.
Or no. Oh.
You're just smelling food.
So sad.
Yeah. Well, that can be what it's like with ADHD sometimes.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. The word transfer is sort of in one of the other papers that we found for this topic. In fact, one of the other papers that I found is called Neurobiology of ADHD, a brief review. So the exact same article name as the Chipper Wiggins, but it's sort of a different article and it's much shorter. Like they weren't joking when they said brief.
Yeah. So should we dive into it? We've got two other papers that we want to cover that kind of showcase what's happening now in 2024, what's happening in the dopamine space. Hi, Sky here, just popping in with a quick strategy for you. As some of you might know, we've recently launched the Goals Achieved with ADHD Academy, and some of our members kindly agreed to have their sessions recorded so that I could share them with you. So what you're about to hear is a snippet of a strategy that Amani and I worked on to help her with her goal of getting a job. So hopefully you'll find this strategy helpful, and if you'd like to talk with me about how you can achieve your goals with ADHD, just click the description below to book a free 15-minute focus session and we'll get started together.
How do we beat that procrastination, rejection sensitivity cycle around this incredibly complicated, incredibly rejection sensitive thing?
Applying for a job brings up so much in me. I'm giving myself these deadlines, which are my kryptonite. If I were anybody else, I would be like, it is not a big deal. What matters is that you get them out.
There's different parts of applications in general. Some of them are rejection sensitive, some of them aren't. We need to divide tasks into things that are stressful and things that are not stressful. Do the more relaxed bits, and then we're going to get a bunch of dopamine and chunk together all of the stressful bits and do those together. We want to separate the writing the application self and the sending the application self. How do you feel about the strategy? Are you happy with that as a thing to try?
Yes. Very, very excited about it. That sounds great.
Okay, let's start with the first one. So we've got the one you've just mentioned. So this is called Neurobiology of ADHD, a brief review from the World Journal of Advanced Reviews and Research. And what they wanted to do, basically, similar to the 2009 paper, is just review the current literature on the dopamine hypothesis. We love these papers. They do a great job. Shout out to these wonderful papers. So one of the big things, I guess, is, okay, what is dopamine? How does it make sense? So I'm going to start with is just an explanation of that. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is synthesized in certain neurons in the brain, and it occurs through a couple of steps. So it's got an amino acid that's obtained from dietary protein. That can be how it happens, called tyrosine. That's taken up into the blood. I'm a little bit squeamish, but we'll keep keep going. So yeah, and then it's there's also tyrosine is then converted into what is called L-DOPA, and then that is converted into dopamine. So there's a little sort of chain of events that happens there. And, we will talk to our team about making a nice visual that can kind of explain that. And then the dopamine is stored in the neuron, ready for release when that neuron fires. And so what is kind of been assumed and considered and is going to be discussed here about dopamine is that it's different. How that works is different for people with ADHD, which is kind of at a base level, one of the issues that we're having when we're like, oh, I have to do that thing. Oh, never mind. Or, oh, I don't remember like what I need to do. I don't remember the steps, or I feel really bored. I just can't do the rest of today. That's what we are feeling. But that sort of system from, the synthesis of dopamine from tyrosine, the amino acid, to L-DOPA, to then being stored in the neuron is what's happening in our brain. It's ready there. It's like, let me out. Let's go. Let's make some dopamine. Let's make some rewards. But it's a bit different for us.
By the way, tyrosine is found in meat and so a protein. So that's often why people will tell you with ADHD, you're meant to have a protein-heavy breakfast. The idea is that, you can make more L-DOPA, which will then convert into dopamine. Now, yeah, like lacking in dopamine is sort of the colloquial way that we explain what's going on in our brains. But as the other paper kind of shows, that's not exactly what's happening. It might be both.
Yeah.
It's situational, right?
Yeah, it's a bit situational and it's very complicated, but I think once you understand it or once you get a sense of it, it really just rockets you away from that. Do I have ADHD? Oh, I did a survey and it said this, but not that. So I guess I have this. It's like, no, your brain is working completely differently and we can see it and we have information about it and we have information about it for years and years. And I think that just creates so much more of a sense of confidence about your brain, even though obviously we're talking about our brains being different, which can be frustrating as well.
Especially when you can't see that necessarily from the outside. And then having to deal with like other people's perceptions of that.
Exactly.
That's really where the issue comes most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. But boy, do we feel it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to dive back into that, brief review, which we're definitely probably making longer, let's talk about, what they found. So I guess, Sarah, do you want to give us a sentence of what they found?
Basically, they cite a worldwide prevalence of ADHD at 5.29% based on sort of 102 studies. They also were looking at meta on twin studies and heritability rates, and they put the heritability rate of ADHD at 76%.
Yeah.
Wow. I had to go check this source because that just like knocked my socks off. And I found that it's been cited 722 times. So,
yep. Call your parents, call your kids. It's highly likely everyone has it.
yeah.
And then what did they find in terms of our neurobiology, in terms of our dopamine and things like that?
Basically, they found that there's more to the ADHD neurobiology question than just dopamine dysfunction. Noradrenaline and adrenaline, or norepinephrine and epinephrine, also play a functional and observable role, as indicated by the studies into SSNRs, which is a classification of medication that they're using with like ADHD now, and it's helping.
Yeah, definitely. And so what they were concluding from that was that this is not all caused by a single gene, ADHD, but it's by the combined effect of multiple genes. And that's something I think we talked about a while ago when we talked about the genetics of ADHD.
Yes, the genome with Abby.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that it is a combination of multiple genes might also explain why some of us might have a different sort of dopamine problem, if you will. Like, it's entirely possible that some of us have low dopamine, and then it's entirely possible some of us just, our dopamine doesn't go in the right mailbox or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're seeing here in 2024, and it might have been, happening in 2009 as well, but what we're seeing here is a real expansion of the concept of, what it is that is causing our ADHD struggles. It's the dopamine for sure, but it's also some other areas. It's that norepinephrine, it's that epinephrine as well. So do you want to take us through, because I can see a little note here that just says rabbit hole to find out what catecholamines are. So do you want to take us through a little bit more about that?
Sure. I still do that thing where if I don't know what a word means, then I have to look it up. And catecholamine is one of those words. It's basically just a group of neurotransmitters that include dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Does that sound familiar? Oh, yeah. It's what I was just talking about.
Yeah.
And basically, what I can say is that all three of those are made from the same core L-dopa molecule, if you will.
Yeah.
It starts out as dopamine, and then when stress happens, that triggers norepinephrine. And then when that happens, also epinephrine gets released. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter, and epinephrine is the hormone. They are both part of that sort of fight or flight response.
Are they proposing that it's not just the dopamine that's different, it's also the norepinephrine that's different, it's also the epinephrine that's different in ADHD brains?
Well, if there was low amounts of dopamine, then there would also be low amounts of norepinephrine.
Of course, yeah.
Actually, what it seems like is that the dopamine is being converted into norepinephrine when it shouldn't be. So your dopamine is being turned into stress, and you're just trying to send an email.
Oh my gosh. That's so interesting. That's when it should just be turning into motivation and like, woohoo, we got this.
It should be like, wow, I'm sending this email. Look at me go. And it's like, oh no, I have 20 emails. That's 20 choices.
It's funny you should say that because, and I don't know how this works structurally, but when we work with clients, one of the things I often find myself having to do is really take a minute and say, hey, you did it. Congratulations. Because so often I'll have people come up and they'll be like, oh, I'm so stressed. This is the worst week and everything's terrible. And I'll be like, okay, like, cool. Let's work on it. This is what we do. And so I break down like, hey, what happened? And I find out what happened is that they did something that was on the list, sometimes a list for ages, and just blew right past it. That sense of reward was just missing.
It's almost like you're still in shock of having done the thing. Especially if it's a really big thing.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that we could take what should be a reward and turn it into stress, essentially.
I think that's really sad. But yes, I think it makes a lot of sense. It would probably resonate with a lot of people.
Oh, I'm sure. I think we've all been there. Yeah, so the next paper that we had, also from 2024, looking at dopamine, this was an interesting paper because it was focusing on people who they called drug naive, which is interesting because often they don't talk about medication so much. Sometimes people are most of the time, either everyone's on medication or maybe they've just mixed the two together. And I think it's interesting that they didn't do that in this case. So what they wanted to do was it's called reduced dopamine transporter availability in drug-naive adult ADHD. And the word dopamine and the word transporter should be interesting to you now based on that 2009 paper. This is from the Journal of Psychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience Reports. And they wanted to look at what is the relationship between ADHD symptoms and dopamine transporter availability, which they called DAT. So Sarah, do you want to take us through what this study did? Because this was a study. This was not a literature review.
Yeah, this was the actual study, and it's actually really cool. I learned a lot from this paper too. So this is a neuroimaging study, and they used a specific type of PET scan that also collected MRI data, but they used a specific method called single photon emission tomography. They were basically trying to look at the dopamine as it moved throughout the brain.
That's so interesting. So now we're really into it. We're looking at such interesting things
here
now.
we are.
Yeah.
Like in 2024. Fantastic. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. So we have 40 participants total, 20 drug-naive patients with ADHD, which means non-medicated, and then 20 age and sex-matched neurotypical controls, which means like as closely as possible, they replicated these people, but no disorders, period. You would be excluded if you had any other disorder aside from ADHD.
Okay. So what were they measuring then?
Yeah, so they've got some measures here. ADHD diagnosis was determined by clinical interview. We love that. Severity of symptoms. They were looking at a self-report scale, the CARS, which we mention quite often. They gave an IQ test, MRI scan. And then again, they were looking at the dopamine transporter availability based on the visual output of the SPECT, which again was mapping out like the different regions of the brain and then watching the dopamine sort of go from one area to the other.
Which, oh gosh, this is completely nerdy, but I would have loved to have seen how that was working. Like watching.
Yeah, where's the video, guys?
Yeah, release the tapes. I want to know what it looks like differently in ADHD and non-ADHD brains. I think that would have been so interesting. What did they find?
Differences.
Well, I'm glad. Otherwise, this would have been a very confusing episode.
You know, I think it's not super important to mention the specific regions of the brain without necessarily saying what that means. But in one area of the brain, they found that the dopamine transporter availability was decreased compared to the control group, which means that the dopamine wasn't sending those messages effectively in that specific region. However, they found that intelligence was shown to moderate that relationship.
This is interesting because there was a study that we spoke about last week that also talked about intelligence testing, moderating it. I wonder if there's more people doing that kind of intelligence testing, moderating system now because they're finding all these people with ADHD that they didn't realize.
Yeah, that's a really, it's one of the core parts, like really inside in the limbic system.
Which part of the brain are you looking at?
The nucleus accumbens, the first point.
Yeah. So in the nucleus accumbens, what they found was that there was a difference in how the dopamine transporter occurred in people who had ADHD, but it was mitigated by an intelligence test, basically.
Yes.
So would that indicate that people who are higher intelligence according to the test are using some kind of way of masking or adjusting in a way that supports them differently? I'm interested. What's the conclusion they came to from that?
So that area, they go on to talk about it being part of the reward system.
Are they indicating that maybe people who scored higher on the intelligence scale had a better idea of maybe what the reward was going to? Yeah, it's just curious because it kind of ties back to that original paper on, the idea that our brain isn't giving us a neurological reward and we have to wait for the behavioral reward. and other people get both. And so I'm wondering if there might be a world where people who score more highly on intelligence are more able to like conjure up, for lack of a better word, the sense of the reward and the understanding of what it is and how it works. So it's like, okay, if I do this thing, I'm going to get this reward and it's going to give me these things. It's just an interesting observation. I'm not sure the answer.
Well, it also makes me wonder if the reason that the IQ is higher also supports the regions of the brain that make it easier to do the thing, or like, you know what I mean? That like support you to do the thing.
I have to be honest, I have a bit of a problem. I think this is the thing we talked about last time. I feel very uncomfortable about this idea of intelligence mitigating ADHD, and I'm not sure why, but I just want to maybe be a bit upfront with that.
Maybe whatever makes you good at a test might also support your executive functioning elsewhere.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But I do find it, I mean, this is the second paper that's found it, but it feels, I guess, a little bit unfair. Like it feels a little bit, but I guess some people have ADHD, some people don't. And there's benefits and negatives to both of those things. So I imagine that's the same with these other systems. But yeah, it is. I really hope that we don't start breaking people with ADHD into groups. And I don't know.
That's a good point. Like, why is the distinction important?
Yeah, why is this the second paper that's looked at an intelligence test? I mean, I know why, because they're finding differences. Hopefully what it means is that they're just finding more ways to give more people support, and they're just doing their thing to do that. But I don't know, it just makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable for some reason. Like, are they going to say, oh, well, you're a high intelligence person with ADHD, you don't have it? Or I don't know, there's like this weird, but this person has a different kind of ADHD. I don't know, it's interesting.
Well, it might be to show that actually it's harder to detect in higher IQ.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think we know that.
I don't know. Maybe that's just me trying to find the silver lining, or like look on the bright side, guys.
Yeah.
I'm wearing yellow today for everyone who's listening. Also my nails.
Yeah, it's very, very spring.
Sorry.
Spring Barbie. Okay, so what else did they find?
Yeah, so actually they did find that inattentive symptoms were negatively associated with DAT availability, dopamine transporter availability, in specifically the caudate nucleus. Basically, that means that more inattentive symptoms were observed when you had less dopamine available in those areas.
Interesting. And again, that's deep in the brain. And when we say deep in the brain, what we mean is it's the part of the brain that evolutionarily is like the old part of the brain. It's considered to be like the lizard part of the brain, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When I looked up what it is and what it does, it says it helps you manage incoming information and responses, especially when it comes to actions that you do automatically, like habits.
Interesting.
Focus, impact, focus, and attention. It's a huge, huge factor for us, I think. And so this is a really big finding.
Yeah. So what does that look like if you're a person? So if you're someone who doesn't have a sense of what all these words mean, and you're just going, okay, but what does that look like as I'm walking around in my day? I'm doing this, and this is the outcome. So can you give me an example of like what somebody would be struggling with if they were having this problem?
So somebody who might have inattentive symptoms are people who are prone to mind wandering. You might be told like, can't you just pay attention? Like, are you even listening to me? Well, they're seeing functionally that the caudate nucleus, which is a really important like station in your brain for focus and attention, don't have any like workers. There's nobody there to like make your coffee. And so the dopamine is like, okay, and it can't stop there. And it can't help you to like regulate the focus and the attention because the dopamine just can't stop there.
Interesting.
Or at least not as effectively as it's supposed to.
Yeah. That is a really interesting result.
So can't you just pay attention? Like, no, actually.
My dopamine receptors won't go there.
The dopamine has left the building.
And I think, again, that's really helpful. I think, once you understand it, it's really helpful. This is why I love neuroscience, is it makes things so much more concrete.
Yeah. I mean, I was sort of scrambling, looking for like some skills to pull out of this, right? But really, I just think that educating yourself on what your brain does, and like how it makes the things can be the skill. Like, that's really important. You should know that.
Yeah, it's really helpful to feel that confidence. I think it's one of the reasons people say to me, like, oh, but like, don't you feel insecure about ADHD? And this documentary came out and that thing came out. And it's like, no, because, I know about the neuroscience and I understand how our brains are functionally different. And I could see that functional difference occurring in my own life. And then we develop strategies to help support those functional differences and those dopaminergic pathways. That's what we're doing when we're doing coaching. It sounds simple, but it's got that sort of background to it. And yeah, I think it's, in terms of the skill takeaway, the biggest one besides everything, because everything kind of comes from the space, is your reward system is functionally different. And so it needs a different type of reward. So, for example, a reward for starting something, taking longer breaks, transitioning into something in a more supportive way, because your dopamine's not just going to go there and like get it started for you. These are all the differences that might seem like we're just giving ourselves a nice thing. Oh, do we deserve it? I don't know. Well, really, you're just making up for a lack of what is in your brain. If you were in somebody else's brain, again, I have ADHD, so I wouldn't know for sure, but the research indicates that it might be a pretty nice place to be. There's coffee, to your example, Sarah. There's interns. Can I take your coat? Do you want this? Do you want that? Great job, guys. And we just don't have any of that stuff going on in our brain. And so we need to, add to it in the real world.
Yeah. If your brain won't give you the stimulation on its own, homemade is fine. Find another way to sort of stimulate that. It can never be something that you should do. Just dopamine is not something that you should do. Like, yeah, should you do these things? Yeah, sure. But like, if it's something that's like, oh, I should do this, that's not your dopamine friend. Move on.
Yeah. If your idea is like, well, I know I should go and I should probably get some chores done. Nope, that's not the dopamine that you're looking for.
If you're excited to race yourself and empty the dishwasher as fast as possible, that might be your dopamine. But if you're like, oh, I really should do, no, that's not it. It's like a fundamental mindset shift.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just felt like that was an important distinction, because it's definitely something that people do a lot in the beginning when they're first introducing themselves to like dopamine activities.
Yeah, exactly. That whole sense of like, oh, I couldn't possibly eat that much chocolate. It's not just chocolate. You can do all the 5 senses. There's lots of different ways. We talk about it all the time to get that dopamine. We have a whole sensory support system in our academy. Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting sort of look back and look forward. You can sort of see how the research has developed. We have different ways of understanding it. We're bringing in different systems in the brain that are working together or working against us. And we're bringing in this idea of something like intelligence and other things like that and how that mitigates it. But fundamentally, that base sense of our brains are different, it's been there since 2009 or before, because they were looking at other studies.
Definitely before.
It's still here, still alive and well in 2024, still being very much studied.
Just the evidence just keeps getting piled on. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, in academia, we always talk about this, this triangle, and your little paper is at the top of the mountain. This mountain of stuff, and so we are now getting this mountain of research, and it's great to see. It's really, really cool, because it makes it so much more confidence inducing than, oh, well, this person did this and maybe this is my ADHD or maybe it's not. It gives a real sense of confidence.
Acceptance too. Like confidence is important. And like just knowing this isn't even accepting necessarily, right? Like Because you can know something, but then still beat yourself up for doing it. You know, you could know that you have ADHD and you're prone to being late. If you do nothing about it, but you continue to get upset at yourself for it, well, that's not necessarily fair. You know, you've done nothing to change the problem. With this dopamine thing, you know, there's some we can do, but once you accept, like Skye said, that like your motivation system, your reward system is triggered differently. You don't have that anticipatory tickle, like unless it's something that you're intrinsically motivated by. You need to give yourself that tickle or, you know, swift kick, or
positively.
Yeah. I mean, you know, maybe that swift kick is like going outside and like actually smelling a flower. That's a stark change from where I'm sitting right now. That'd be a nice dopamine break.
That's what I'm going to do right after this podcast is go outside and smell a flower. Yeah, definitely.
But you have to accept the need for that in order to actually do something about it. You can't just know.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has been an amazing podcast episode, a bit longer, but I think it's so important to talk about. And thank you so much to everybody who is still here, still listening. I hope you understand your brain a lot better now, and you feel a lot more confident. And thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks, as always, to our wonderful team. Thanks to Adam, our editor. We will see you again soon for another episode. Bye. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.